All right, guys, thank you for bearing with me. This is part three of chapter 20. So, to go back, we left off at the Scopes trial, which is the state of Tennessee versus John Scopes, which took place in 1925, where Scopes is arrested for teaching Darwin's theory of evolution in the school. He is found guilty in the lower court, but is later overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court. It's also during this time in the 1920s, again, because remember, society is changing. And so you get that equal and opposite reaction that whenever you see some freedoms expand, there is a revolt in a way, and you see some of these freedoms shrink. And that includes with immigration. The golden door closes at this time. There's a change in immigration policy. In 1921, a temporary measure restricted immigration from Europe to just 357,000 persons per year, which was one third of the annual average prior to World War One. So in 1923, they shrink immigration from Europe to just 357,000 per year, again, which is just a third of the annual average prior to World War One. Then in 1924, Congress permanently limited European immigration to just 150,000 per year. They did this because they wanted to ensure that the descendants of old immigrants would always outnumber the children of new immigrants. They also will bar the entry of Asians into the country. So the golden door closes. This new immigration law really reflected this heightened emphasis on race as a determinant of public policy. So it's during this time, of course, it's during the Jim Crow era. So in the South and in the North, Blacks are relegated to second class citizenship, and immigration is limited to an ideal population. So even though cultural pluralism describes a society that glorifies ethnic diversity rather than suppressing it. It's at this time that we don't have cultural pluralism. We don't glorify ethnic diversity as being the essence of society. We will glorify the idea, I'll say, of the melting pot, that when you come into America, you become part of this homogenous structure where everyone is the same, right? That is the melting pot versus, a tossed salad. Now, immigrant groups will assert their validity or assert the validity of cultural diversity, and they will identify tolerance of difference as being the essence of American freedom. So immigrants will have their own definition of American freedom and say it's really the glorification of cultural diversity that makes America great. This is also the era, I'll shift gears. This is also the era of Harlem. Harlem emerges as being the sociocultural mecca of Black society. So you'll get a lot of migrants from the South, you'll get a lot of immigrants from the West Indies who will settle in Harlem. Harlem was this small area, this small borough in New York that is known for being a Black area in New York. Most Harlem businesses, even though it is known as being a Black area, this is where Black people live, most Harlem businesses were owned by whites. It is seen as the capital, though, of Black America. Um, Oh, okay. So the Harlem Renaissance, we'll talk about this. It's during the Harlem Renaissance that we see this upsurge of consciousness among Black Americans, and we see this explosion of artistic expression and the idea of the new Negro. So the new Negro rejected established stereotypes, and they really wanted to search for other values to put in the place of these stereotypes. So, some of our most famous Renaissance poets and writers were Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote Their Eyes Are Watching God. Langston Hughes wrote a number of poems as well as short stories. And one of my favorite short stories of his is titled Blessed Assurance. We also get County Cullen, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Count Basie. We get this explosion of Black music, of Black artistry, of Black I said music, artistry, poetry, books. You get this expression where you're able, I'll say, you get Black literature. It's really the first time in American society that we have Black literature that talks about Black experiences from a Black point of view, right? This is really where we get that. And even though she is not a child of the Renaissance, I will say an author who I would say is similar, her writing is very similar to a Renaissance author would be Toni Morrison, in that she spoke of a Black experience, right, from a Black perspective. So it's during this time that you get this upsurge of consciousness, you get this upsurge of artistry during the Harlem Renaissance. Now, what's interesting is that even though it's this capital of Black America, a lot of the businesses were owned by whites. And one of the most famous clubs in Harlem at this time was the Cotton Club. But the Cotton Club didn't really employ, it only employed like light skinned Black dancers to their review, and Black people could not patronize the uh, the Cotton Club. You couldn't go there and be served, but you could perform at the Cotton Club. So it's at this time that you get the jazz of the Roaring Twenties, right? It's during this era of the Harlem Renaissance, or Renaissance. There's no T. I apologize for that. Okay, so we move on to the election of 1928. So, in the election of 1928, it is an election between Herbert Hoover, who is a Republican, and Albert Smith, who is a Democrat from New York. So, Albert Smith was a Democrat, and he was also the first Catholic to be nominated by a major party. He served 3 terms as governor in New York, or governor of New York. However, Hoover ends up winning the election. It's still at this time in society where in America there is a pretty strong anti-Catholic sentiment. That anti-Catholic sentiment will continue. It's not until JFK that we get a Catholic president, because America is pretty anti-Catholic during this time and will continue to be anti-Catholic. Hoover ends up winning the election of 1928. He has about, I would say, about a year of a decent presidency until Black Tuesday. So, Black Tuesday is when the stock market crashes, and that is October 29th, 1929. The stock market crashes. The significance of this is that about $10 billion just evaporates, just vanishes in the matter of hours. So, in the matter of 5 hours, about $10 billion in market value just vanishes. Now, the stock market crash in and of itself doesn't create the depression. It doesn't create the Great Depression by itself. You have the stock market, and then you have the economy. And the way that I like to explain this to my students is that yes, the stock market, yeah, it's important, but then you have the economy. And what's the difference? We are the economy. We are what keeps the economy rolling. If the people don't have money, then you're not spending money. If you're not spending money, the economy isn't going to move, right? Because we, you, me, and any and everyone watching, we are the economy. Now, remember, most American families at this time don't have savings. Once the stock market crashes, a lot of the banks fail. And this is at a time where there is no FDIC. The FDIC is a Federal Depositors Insurance, right? And so whenever you put your money in the bank, your banks usually, at least back in the day, would have stickers that say FDIC insured, meaning that if anything happens and this bank fails, you don't lose your money. Your money will stay exactly where it is. Unfortunately, the FDIC didn't come about until we're in the Great Depression as a measure to try to um, I don't know, as a measure to try to help the Great Depression. So there is no FDIC. So people who had their money in banks lost their money because there is no FDIC. There is no getting your money back. In 1930, just a year after the stock market crashes, about 26,000 businesses will fail. And when these businesses fail, people lose their jobs. And there's this downward, this relentless downward slide of stocks. So, for example, US Steel stock prices went from being about $260 a share to being just $22 a share. GM or General Motors stock prices also really just fell to the bottom, right? It went from being about $73 a share to just $8 a share. So if you invested in the stock market, let's say, I'm just going to go on my calculator here. Let's say you at one time had 20 shares of US Steel. So 20 shares of US Steel is about $5,240, right? Prior to the Great Depression, because again, that's 262 times 20, which should get you about 5,240. Well, since those shares, the price of it fell, your 20 shares that were worth 5,240 and now it's 22. Now those shares are only worth $440. So you see how that would impact. If your price per share was 262 and you had 20 shares, now your shares rather, are only worth $440. So you see this relentless downside of stocks, and it's like you just lose your money. You just lose out. People stopped investing in the economy. People didn't have any money. And so if people don't have any money, they can't shop. We are the ones who keep the economy running. Every time you go to the store to buy necessities, you are buying into the economy. But if people don't have money, they don't spend money. And the economy will slowly kind of go to a standstill. You can't spend money that you don't have. So if you don't take care of the people, if the people don't have money to spend, your economy is not going to do very well. You have extremely high tariffs on imported goods at this time. Europe will retaliate by imposing tariffs on US goods. Then also at the time of the Great Depression, we also have the Dust Bowl, which is a man-made disaster that we'll talk about next chapter that will greatly impact America's heartland. So it's bad thing after bad thing after bad thing. Now, with Americans and the Depression, we see a horrible transformation of the American way of life. A lot of families will move into shanty towns because they can no longer afford their rent or no longer afford their mortgage. Hundreds of thousands of people are looking for work, but unfortunately, there just aren't any jobs. So people will move from the farms, or from, I'm sorry, people will move from the cities to the farms in an effort just to feed their families. And so you also, I would say things really come to a head um, in the spring of 1932, or at least with a group of people with the bonus army. And so World War I veterans will march on Washington demanding an early payment to bonuses. So World War I vets were promised a bonus that was due in 1945. But since they're out of work, they don't have any money, they're fighting for survival, 20,000 unemployed World War I vets will march on Washington in an effort to try to get early payment for these bonuses because they're just trying to survive. They will end up being driven away by federal soldiers led by Douglas MacArthur. A lot of the camps that they had set up along the way will also be burned. Now, to a lot of Americans, well, let me back up. What is Hoover's response? What is the government's response during this time? Well, a lot of Americans, or to a lot of Americans, Hoover's response seemed both inadequate and uncaring. So, Hoover, I wouldn't say, a lot of people will say, well, Hoover was a horrible president because he didn't do anything to help people during the Great Depression. But it's also important to remember, for context, that at this time, Hoover shares the conventional view of the times. So he really, at this time, the government typically didn't step up to help people. Government intervention for Hoover and a lot of presidents really prior to Hoover, they felt that government intervention would do little to spur, any type of economic recovery. And they really felt that if they helped people, that it would encourage people to rely on the government. And so Hoover, perhaps foolishly, puts his faith in volunteerism. So, what is volunteerism? He is hoping that corporations will voluntarily help people, that they will voluntarily hire folks and voluntarily pay people a nice, livable wage. But volunteerism doesn't work. It didn't work then. Um, People weren't going to voluntarily hire more people to pay out more money. So volunteerism is a massive failure. And so for a lot of people, they view Hoover as being really out of touch with the present reality, or with the present plight of a lot of American people. So if you are following along on your slides, on the next slide, I have a picture of a shanty town, and they became known as Hoovervilles. So people living in cardboard boxes, in a collection of cardboard houses. These are known as Hoovervilles. And if you didn't have any money and you reach inside your pocket and you turned it inside out, that was known, your empty pocket was known as a Hoover flag, right? So by 1932, he was pretty much forced to admit that volunteerism had failed to stem the Great Depression because nothing really changes. But he does put in place the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that loaned money to failing banks. However, how about the people? Because the people are the economy. So, and the federal home loan bank system will offer aid to homeowners who are threatened with foreclosure. And so, once we get to chapter 21 and we're talking about the New Deal, of course, Hoover will not win re-election. Instead, he will lose to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who will have an idea of economic, or to spur economic recovery, called the New Deal. And the New Deal will be a program where the government will create jobs and hire people for these jobs. The government will also offer contracts to construction companies to be able to work on these different projects. And so, since Hoover, I would say, if Hoover helped people, if Hoover put in a plan to help people, maybe he would have won re-election. But Hoover doesn't help anyone. People are struggling. People are losing their homes. People are starving. And Hoover doesn't give any type of aid or help. And so, because of that, he is seen as being incredibly out of touch with the plight of the American people. So, I hope you enjoyed this chapter. I hope you understood. I will see you guys back with chapter 21. All right. See you guys later.